Recording. All right. So yeah, hey guys, we're just gonna do a real, basically just you're all gonna lead for the most part. This is basically just sort of extended office hours, basically, just a chance to go over any last sort of questions people had on anything on the study guide. The only thing that I sort of had scheduled that I wanted to talk about was I just wanted to go through quiz 16 and quiz 17, which we didn't have time to talk about in class on Friday. So try to go through those real fast, and then the rest of the time is for you all to ask any questions you've got. So let's just, I was figuring just real quick go through those quizzes, and then go through any questions you all have. So let me pull up quiz 16. So this was the quiz that was dealing with inductive generalizations, and this is a good opportunity to just review inductive generalizations, if nothing else. Some people struggled with this quiz a little bit more than some of the others. So all of your answers to every question that pertains to an inductive generalization, the first or second sentence should have something to do with representativeness. That's the only thing that sort of matters with any of these inductive generalizations. That's the only meaningful question to sort of ask or answer. So in this case, you're asked to sort of analyze an objection. Someone objects to an inductive generalization. You're going to need to analyze their objection in terms of whether or not the sample group really is representative. So you make statements about alcoholics in general on the basis of a study using entirely male samples. My experience as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, however, suggests that there are significant differences between male and female alcoholics. This is particularly noticeable with regards to incidence of severity and depression. All right, so let's phrase this objection. What is this person's objection? The objection is the study is not representative of the overall population. Why not? It, in particular, commits the fallacy of biased statistics. It sort of, for systemic reasons, wildly does not represent the population. And there are indeed a great many female participants in the overall population. Maybe, I don't know the rough rate of male versus female instances of alcoholism, but probably at least close enough to 50% anyway, that nearly half the population, if not more, is being excluded. So then the only real question is this a fair objection? And I would say, yes, this is indeed a fair objection. It's a good objection. This is indeed committing the fallacy of biased statistics. Now, a few people noted, and this is quite reasonable, that the person making the objection could be engaging in an anecdotal evidence fallacy. That's indeed quite reasonable. You're not wrong. That's why I threw it in. Right, he's relying, let's say it's a he's relying on just his own individual experience to sort of make this claim about things about relating severity and depression with regard to alcoholism. And that's indeed perhaps a fair point. It would not be justified to assume that there are necessarily these differences, right? But it is at least reasonable to worry that there might be such differences because of this sort of systemic error present within the way the sampling methods that were used in this case. Then let's turn to the second one. So here's sort of a representative of the kind of thing. Here's a good place where, again, this review will hopefully be a little bit helpful. A lot of people weren't answering this question in the right way. So let me go through what sort of a good answer to this question looks like. So first, you had to identify the sample group in the population. So the sample group, brown dogs in the park today. And the population, all brown dogs. Or you could say all dogs or something like that. But the population, probably the best formulation of it would be all brown dogs, or all brown dogs in the entire world, or something like that. That was pretty good. People did mostly fine with that. How representative is the sample? Here's where things get tricky in a sense. And we'll do both parts 3 and parts 2 at the same time. The question is, how representative is the sample of the population? Right. There are 2 factors that go into this. Sample size and the diversity of the sample group. Right. The way a lot of people went wrong on this quiz, only talking about sample size. You can't really talk about sample size and how large the sample needs to be unless you do a lot of math. You can calculate exactly how large a sample needs to be representative, at least in principle. And you all don't have the capacity to do that, right? So by and large, sample size is not something you should be talking about. There are indeed some exceptions if it's some egregiously small number, like if some people brought up that they didn't know exactly how many dogs even were at the park. Was it only 1 dog at the park? Okay, that's reasonable, right? At least as a worry. But if it's any sort of number, let's say more than 10 or whatever, right? It's you just have to calculate exactly how large it needs to be. What you should be talking about is the diversity of the sample group. That's the thing that you sort of are all in a position to talk about without doing extensive math. And in this case, then, what I saw, people who did a good job on this problem, what I saw people frequently saying is the sample is not representative because why? Why is it not representative? Because if this dog park might well be favoring small dogs. And so smaller dogs are more prevalent in larger cities. Or, this is again something many people brought up on their quiz, and I thought this was perfectly reasonable too. Or maybe you could say maybe this neighborhood just has people tend to like smaller dogs in this neighborhood. Right. And indeed, there's probably only certain kinds of dog breeds that live in a particular area, right? Different dog breeds are sort of more heavily located in different areas. As a result, just looking at one park is not enough to give you something representative. Because, and this is sort of the key part, because one park just won't give you a diverse enough sample. This way of putting it, and again, many of you put it this way, but this way of putting it, you do build in a little bit, right? There's this sample size question, but now you're putting it just in terms of this diversity of the sample. And that's something you can do without the heavy math here. And so someone's asking in the chat question, what does the brownness of the dogs have to do with it? Nothing, ultimately, right? Probably, I mean, we all, or at least if you know anything about dogs, you probably suspect that the fact that these dogs happen to be brown and small, this is probably just a coincidence, right? Because this one person looking on one day in one place, probably the person just got unlucky. In fact, dog size probably has very little to do with roundness. Right? Yeah, that's sort of when one of these inductive generalizations go wrong. The way they're going to go wrong is by drawing sort of just coincidental correlations between things. Whereas if they had done maybe a study of maybe 30 different parks from across the nation and noticed the same correlation, maybe there really is a real correlation, right? But just on the basis of this one study, we have no good reason to suspect that this wasn't just a sort of coincidence. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that that responded well to the chat question. But follow it up if not. And yeah, so the basic idea here is when you've got one of these inductive generalization problems, what you should be looking at is, does the diversity present within the sample group reflect the diversity presence in the overall population? That's really the only thing worth talking about. None of the other issues are really sort of germane. All right, how are we doing here? Anyone have any questions about any of those questions? About any of those? All right, let's do the other quiz real fast. Again, this will just be another good sort of review opportunity. And then after that, I'm just planning on turning it over to you all. So here we go. We should have the next quiz up. All right, so this one was just the last quiz, the quiz that was due on Friday. People did reasonably well on these. I was reasonably happy with them. So first, you were asked to sort of identify the psychological, social, or cognitive bias that you just see within the argument. And again, there are many ways you could sort of describe it. My paper on the decay of large stars should have been accepted for publication. I have plenty of data to support my hypothesis. But wasn't there a recent study done that failed to confirm some parts of your theory? How did you account for that in your paper? The study had obvious flaws in its methodology. There was no reason to take it seriously. Couple obvious ones. I gave you full credit if I saw either of these. The sort of obvious ones that's sort of at play here is first the need to be right. That seems to be pretty prevalent, right? This scientist A, right, sort of just wants their theory to be right so thoroughly that they're not sort of willing to sort of take seriously things that challenge it. And probably closely related, indeed a lot of you said both of these, and I thought that was, I think both of these are pretty clearly present. There's also the cognitive bias of confirmation bias here. A is tending to discount evidence that doesn't confirm the hypothesis. Now, a couple of you said my side bias. It wasn't a bad answer. I didn't take much off for it. But my side bias is a little bit not right here. Right, though it's close, and I gave you most of the credit for it. But my side bias is where you're not really aware of the evidence. Right? And that's not exactly what's going on in this case. A knows about this study, is aware of it in some sense, and is aware that indeed it does sort of threaten the theory, but just is sort of dismissing it. So my side bias isn't an awful answer, but it's a little bit off in this case. Same thing with ideological fixity. It's not exactly clear that there's an ideology at play here. At least just based on what I've given you anyway. At least based on what I've given you, there's not any clear ideology. I mean, liking your own theory isn't exactly an ideology. Like an ideology is some sort of like almost like meta-textual framework for interpreting the world. And it's not obvious, at least, what ideology would be at play in the case of A. So I gave full credit for if you said one of these two, and if you said one of these two, I gave you most of the credit for it. But I probably took a half point off or so. All right, we talked a little bit during the Friday office hour session that's posted to YouTube about this second question. The right answer here is the fallacy of incomplete evidence. If you said the fallacy of faulty analogy, you got basically most of the points for it. But again, fallacy of incomplete evidence is just slightly better. So I already explained that during the Friday's office hour portion. That video is available on the class YouTube page if anyone needs to refer back to it. So I won't go over it again, at least unless anyone would like to go over it again. And then pretty much how I graded this problem, I pretty much just, if you said fallacy of incomplete evidence and gave any sort of good explanation of why and gave any sort of like reasonable response, I gave you full points for it. If you said faulty analogy, I probably took a little bit, I might have taken a little bit additional penalty off of it, but probably not. So basically just looking for some rough and reasonable response here. All right. So I hope that was helpful. Just wanted to make sure we had gone over all those quizzes because I haven't had time to really write comments on a lot of these quizzes. My goal has just been to try to get the grading done. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully now you all have answers you can sort of refer back to on quiz 16 and 17. So that's all I had sort of prepared that I wanted to talk about today. So for the rest of the day, the sort of ball is in your all court. What from the exam or what about the exam would you like to discuss? I could also just make up stuff to talk about, I suppose. Right, maybe let's try doing it like this. See if this would be helpful. All right. So let's see. Someone's asking, could you go over what from? I'm assuming you mean from the quiz. Why it's the fallacy? Why the fallacy is? Yeah, why incomplete is better. So we can go over that again real fast. And again, this was a this isn't a point I would get stuck on. This is a reasonably minor point. Fallacy of incomplete evidence. If you can render this as a statistical syllogism, and you can, which I'll show in a second, it's usually just better to characterize things in the strongest possible way. And this argument should most readily be characterized as a statistical syllogism. So let me write it up. So here would be my sort of rendering of person B's argument. The overwhelming majority of pies that I've eaten in the past have been too sweet. This is a pie. Therefore, this will probably be too sweet. And just as I've written this, at least, this is a pretty reasonable example of thought. I mean, we engage in this kind of logic all the time, right? I don't like mushrooms. Why? Because most of the times when I eat mushrooms, I haven't liked them in the past. So if you offered me some mushrooms, I'd probably politely decline. Right? There's nothing unreasonable going on here. Now, you could also characterize this as an analogy. Right? Where the analogs are all those pies I've eaten in the past and this present pie. Right? You could run it that way. And the reason why that's fine, and again, I gave you mostly full points for that, is that all statistical syllogisms are sort of using analogical reasoning. But it's more precise still to characterize it rather than, so if you almost then want to think about it, so analogical arguments are sort of a broader category. Statistical syllogisms are the more precise category. And the same thing is true also of inductive generalizations as well. Inductive generalizations as well, you could characterize it as there being an analogy being drawn between the sample group and the overall population. So that's why you got mostly full credit if you said fallacy of false analogy or faulty analogy. The reason why it's better to give the fallacy of incomplete evidence here, right, is because the fallacy of incomplete evidence is just a more precise characterization of what's went wrong. If you want to put it this way, the mathematical mistake that's sort of being made is made clear by characterizing this as a statistical syllogism. And same thing with inductive generalizations. So if you characterize the error in terms of statistical syllogisms, you're just characterizing it more precisely. If you want to put it this way, all statistical syllogisms are analogical arguments, but not all analogical arguments are statistical syllogisms. Right? So this is just a more precise characterization of it. One way you could sort of think about it, saying that this is committing the fallacy of incomplete evidence really explains why the difference between pies in general and chicken pot pies is relevant. Right? Because it means that chicken pot pies don't fit neatly within the sort of statistical category that was being explored within that first premise. And like I said, don't get too caught up on that because one, you didn't lose, you still basically got an A on the quiz if that's the only thing you got wrong. It wasn't a big deal. And two, I don't know if the similar thing is going to show up on the exam, a similar kind of situation. So it probably isn't worth too much time. All right, good. So maybe does anyone else have any other questions? I'll throw a few out at people, a few questions out at people to see if there's anything that I talk about people want to discuss in greater detail. All right, how about this? So let's say I was to give you a reductio ad absurdum argument. Would you all know how to go about analyzing such an argument? Or would anyone like to discuss how they would have to analyze such a reductio ad absurdum argument? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that was the one where we had the 3 criteria for evaluating it.
Good.
So one, it has to be problematic or something totally out there, like absurd.
That's right. So the way these arguments, so let's just refresh how these arguments work first. But yeah, what you're saying is right. So these arguments work by suggesting that some proposal produces absurd or unacceptable consequences. That's the basic structure of this argument. So the conclusion is always going to be that some position is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because that position causes sort of absurd or unacceptable consequences. Right? And indeed, just like you were saying, first criteria, the consequence that the argument is pointing toward genuinely has to be absurd or unacceptable. Right? So if I was to say, oh, your plan that we give money to the poor is horrible because that and stupid because that will just make everyone happy. That's not a bad consequence, right? Like making everyone happy would be a good thing, it seems like, right? So, but whereas your plan of giving money to the poor is a bad one because it will lead to the downfall of Western civilization. Okay, yeah, that's bad. Wouldn't want that. Don't want the downfall of Western civilization, right? So first thing, just the thing that I'm saying is bad about your idea, the sort of unacceptable thing that follows from your idea, has to genuinely be unacceptable in some sense. This isn't usually going to be where the problem lies. If what problem does occur in one of these arguments, it won't usually be here. The second criteria, we can go back to some earlier fallacies. You have to avoid the straw person fallacy. It has to be getting the idea that it's critiquing right. It has to understand what it's critiquing properly. If, again, remember straw person fallacy just in general, it's really easy to show that something is stupid if you misrepresent it to be something stupid. That's simple. If I say, oh, your plan of giving money to the poor is a terrible idea because it will lead to the downfall of Western civilization, that only is even relevant if your plan is actually to give money to the poor. If I come back and say, that's not exactly what I said. I said I wanted to institute a graduated income tax so that those with less wealth pay a smaller percentage of their net income. That's not the same thing that I was originally critiquing. I misrepresented you. The argument would have failed in that regard. And then the final thing, the argument has to avoid the slippery slope fallacy. The sort of unacceptable or absurd implication has to genuinely be something that's likely to have followed from the proposal. So yes, it's pretty unlikely that my plan of giving some money to the poor is going to lead to the downfall of Western civilization. That seems to be a slippery slope fallacy. There's no sort of justification given as to why you're going to get such extreme consequences from my relatively narrow starting point. And so then that argument would have that violated the third of these criteria. Right, so remember, we're always critiquing something with an reductio ad absurdum. The thing that's supposed to be absurd, it's not the argument itself is absurd. It's not the reductio argument that's absurd. It's an absurdity that's in this idea that we're critiquing. This thing that we're saying is bad, that's the thing that's supposed to produce the unacceptable consequences. In a good reductio ad absurdum, successfully shows that some idea should be rejected because the idea really does produce absurd consequences. So this is not a kind of fallacy. This is a kind of argument that can work or not work. It'll work if it sort of avoids all of these problems.
Could you give an example of a good reductio?
Absolutely. Here would be an example of a good reductio argument. And again, to say that it's a good reductio argument, that doesn't mean that it's not questionable or debatable or that we could go further, but at least, this one is making at least raising a reasonable concern. It is a mistake to say that it is always wrong to lie. There are some times when lying is morally acceptable. For example, if you were hiding Jews in your basement in Nazi Germany, of course it's absurd and ridiculous to say that you should tell the truth when a Nazi soldier knocks on your door. This would be a successful reductio argument. Again, not to say that's not still questionable, right? We could still investigate further. But this argument's sort of working. It's suggesting what I think is a real consequence if you say it's always wrong to lie. If you take that, just, yep, it's always wrong to lie in every case, then it would be then it's wrong to lie to the Nazi who knocks on your door and says, give us the Jew. Are you hiding any Jews in your basement? It would be wrong to say, oh, no, officer, we don't have any Jews hiding in our basement. That would indeed be absurd. Right, and so therefore that suggests that this "it's always wrong to lie" claim is mistaken or false. This is one that shows up in ethics classes, for example. Right, this is a critique that frequently gets made against what's called Kantian ethics or deontological ethics, which suggests that you have an absolute duty to tell the truth. So is that helpful? Is that a good example of a time when this works? Right. Whereas if my initial proposal hadn't been "it's always wrong to lie," it's that it's wrong to lie to your mom about where you were last night. Let's change the situation a little bit. If that's the case, how should we analyze this argument now? Right? I'd say this one now commits the straw person fallacy. Right? The initial claim wasn't that it's always wrong to lie, it's that it was wrong to lie in this particular case. And so therefore we misrepresented the initial position. How are we doing? All right. I'll just keep going through the study guide. I mean, it's fine with me. Fine with me. How about analogical arguments? If you had to analyze an analogical argument, do you all think you'd know how to do so? That's not right. Sorry. That's also not right. Try that. Let's try that again. There you go.
So like, isn't that the one where you like start with analyzing what the analogs actually are, or identifying the analogs?
First thing, identify the analogs. That's exactly right. Analyze the two things that are being compared. And there's a chat question. Let me just go check and see. Yep, good. First, we identify the analogs. Good. Then what? What's the only thing that matters?
Like how similar they are.
Not just that.
Given the argument.
Even then, not just that. That's right. That's one thing. But to say there's another half of it. It's how similar or dissimilar. And ultimately, which matter more? Like that's what you form your basic conclusion on. There's nothing else you should be talking about with these analogical problems. In what respect are the two things being compared similar, and in what respect are they dissimilar? This is a case where very clearly you're going to have to explain your work because people, might think different things are relevant, and that's fine. I'm not going to be grading you so much on that. But what you need to be talking about is relevant similarities, relevant differences, exactly as the chat as it was said in the chat question. And nothing else matters, so don't talk about anything else. You also can say that you need more information, right? Maybe you don't know enough about the things being compared to really say, but then you would need to tell me what would you need to know and why would it matter in terms of relevant similarities and relevant differences. So it's not less work to say I need more information. You still have to do the same amount of work. You just different work. You have to tell me what would you need to know to determine what matters more, the similarities or the differences. And again, sort of justifying and explaining your answer. How are we doing there? Any questions about those analogies? All right. I'm literally just going through the study guide at this point, but that's fine. What about causal arguments? How do we analyze causal arguments? And there, we've got 5 criteria. You follow the 5 criteria, the list of 5 criteria in order.
You find the proposed cause needs to be correlated with the effect.
That's right. That's the first one. First, we've got correlation. Second, we've got temporal order. Third, it has to be a credible cause. If you mess this one up, you're going to commit the post hoc fallacy. So this gets the first 3 we've gotten rid of now of all the sort of bad causal candidates. Things are just not really credible causes. Then we're now in a position that we can sort of start distinguishing amongst the good options. What causal explanation fits the data that's available the best? And if you find one that fits better than all others, that's your answer. You can stop. If multiple fit equally well, then you use Occam's razor. Right? Pick the simpler explanation, the explanation that involves less assumptions, rather than the more complicated assumption that involves the more complicated explanation, rather, that involves more assumptions. And this is a case where we follow these in order. And it's different than the appeals to authority that we'll talk about in a second. With the appeals to authority, you can sort of do them in any order. It's not a sort of checklist. This really is a checklist. You sort of go, up, we can get rid of option 3 because it failed that criteria. Up, we can then get rid of option 5 because of that one, and so on. Right? Until by the end, you end up with just 1. Right? And that's why you can stop at 4 if you really do find one explanation that fits the data better than all others. You don't need to keep going with Occam's razor. The goal, this is sort of a process of elimination. Right? You sort of are crossing off bad candidates as you sort of go until you end up with just one candidate left. And the one that remains, that's the best available explanation. And again, that could change if new evidence gets discovered, but that's the best available at the time, at least. All right. Any questions with these? All right, let's just keep it going. And feel free to go whenever you want. This is totally optional, right? So if people are feeling good, but I might as well just keep going through the study guide. It's fun. So, okay, what about appeals to authority? How do we analyze this kind of argument? Here again, you've got a checklist, but this one is just a list of criteria to sort of analyze. It's not a sequential one. It's not in order.
Like identify the domain and whether
Yep.
Can be expertise or something.
Yep, does the domain admit of expertise? That's the first one. Second, is there agreement within the domain about the topic? Third, is the person speaking the most authoritative one to speak about the topic? Fourth one, this might be slightly different than the order in the book. I don't remember exactly the order in the book, but this is close enough. Anyway, does the speaker have any problematic conflicts of interest? Has the speaker had a chance to actually consider the topic before speaking? Has the expert's claims been subject to peer review? And finally, what is the last one? I'm blanking on the last one, sorry. Oh, yeah. Last one, can the expert give a plausible sort of summary of why what they're saying is true? So this isn't a checklist in the same way. And just in general, analyzing these appeals to authority is more complicated than a lot of the other arguments we've looked at. Excuse me. Right. This admits of a lot of gradation. Sometimes, as a result of violating one or more of these criteria, you'll want to reject the argument altogether. But other times, you'll just perhaps lessen your confidence in the expert testimony as a result of the violation.
So could you give an example of each of those times? Because I feel like it's
sure.
Rejecting it completely is really extreme, and I don't know exactly what qualifies as enough for that.
So think about it like this, because this is really the key, and this is what makes these so difficult to analyze. Okay, if you interpret on a most basic level, what appeals to authority say is believe something is true because I say so. When do you reject the appeal altogether if you just say, no, I'm not gonna, I've got enough reasons to be suspicious of what you're saying that I'm just not going to accept what you say because you said so. And this is roughly the same thing as saying it commits the fallacy. At least for our purposes in this class anyway, we're not really going to worry about it. If you still do go along with it, but you're a little bit more suspicious, that would be an example of this sort of second case. Right, so here would be an example maybe of both cases. So if you go to a doctor because you're feeling chest pain, let's just say, and the doctor says, "Oh yeah, okay, let me take a look," and the doctor does a good analysis of you, right? So checks you over. And the doctor's like, "Okay, well, I'm not really sure what's going on. I don't detect anything obvious, but I'm concerned that you've got this chest pain. So I'm going to have you go get a chest x-ray, and maybe right in this building right here. By the way, I own the chest x-ray machine, and this is going to cost you a little bit more, right? So, okay, what's the problem here? All right, the doctor has a conflict of interest in this case, right? They have some incentive to get you to get the chest x-ray because they'll make more money if you get a chest x-ray. Would you get and you can almost think of this super practically, like, would you get the chest x-ray though? And I would say probably most of us would still probably get the chest x-ray. Why in that case? Well, one, the doctor has revealed the conflict of interest. He's revealed that he owns the chest x-ray machine. Two, you do indeed feel chest pain, right? So it's not it wouldn't be crazy to suggest that more evidence should be done to try, or more research should be done to try to figure out why. So I'd say probably in that case, I'd go along with it. I'd still get the chest x-ray, but I'd at least be aware in the back of my mind that maybe this guy's just trying to rip me off, but probably I'm gonna go with it. Right. But let's say I've just gone in for a routine checkup now. So let's change the scenario a little bit. Gone in for a routine checkup. My chest feels fine. Nothing's going on. Right? The doctor says the exact same thing. I'm probably not going to get the chest x-ray then. There doesn't seem to be any reason why I would need the chest x-ray. The doctor can't tell me why I need it. Has a conflict of interest. So I'm probably not going to get the chest x-ray in that case. I'm probably going to say, like, yeah, that probably seems like an unnecessary test, a test I don't necessarily think I need. How is that? Yeah, go ahead.
Would like the criteria number 3 be like something like, oh, the doctor's like maybe a chiropractor or something like that?
Okay. And now it's gotten even worse. Yeah, exactly. Now it's gotten even worse because now it's a chiropractor, right? Not someone who really is in a position to really even speak about things like chest health or whatever, right? I mean, chiropractors are indeed experts in a field, but not a relevant one for calling for a chest x-ray. Yeah, I think that works. Whereas, again, if my chiropractor's like, yeah, you maybe should go get a massage, then okay, I'll probably go along with that.
Okay, so it's more something based off of the situation and analyzing the situation based on these criteria. It's
very
not
much
like
so.
This criteria, like if it doesn't agree with number 4 or number 5, then it's absolutely not okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Rejected. Okay.
I mean, if the domain doesn't admit of expertise, that one's always going to be a deal breaker. If you just straight up say, like, there are no such things as moral experts, therefore this is always going to fail.
Right. Okay. Besides that one.
Yeah, and so, but even this one admits of gradations. There are some where you might say this admits of expertise, sort of. And then again, oh, this movie reviewer said this was a bad movie. Should I go? So I was looking forward to it, but maybe I won't go see the movie now, right? Again, that one's going to be a bit more iffy because, like, maybe you think there's expertise about recommending movies, but is it going to override all the other stuff going on in your life or whatever, right? Or do your opinions agree with the expert enough? Or there are some movie reviewers, I just trust their judgment more than others because they just seem to agree with me more than others. But if it's just straight up does not admit of expertise, then yeah, that's always going to be a rejected outright.
On that note, you just brought up with number 2, is there agreement within the domain about the topic?
Right.
Like, is that a classic like art type thing where you could make the case that there's not agreement, or would it have to be like very specific for you to say there is agreement? Like,
again, I would say I think it's a really good question. I would say that tends to be a case where, again, like that's almost like why we kind of don't think there is the same level of expertise in art, because there's not the same level of agreement in art. Conversely, if 90 out of 100 critics are like Transformers 7 sucked, then okay, yeah, that's it's not unanimous, but it's never unanimous with even in the fields that really we think do admit of expertise, like medical things. There's never unanimity.
But we're not going to be dealing with those kind of things on the final, or
it's gonna most of the time. What I'm gonna give you is a case where, at least to me anyway, it seems pretty obvious you would not go along with the person, or where maybe you still would go along with the person but be a little bit more suspicious.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope was that helpful? Was that for both of you? Was that good? All right. We're at the 10:50 mark, so we're done, but I mean, this was optional anyway. So we could just go. I'm happy to just continue to going and just have this go straight into my office hours if you all still like to keep going.
I wouldn't mind, but
Yeah, absolutely.
okay.
Let's keep going then. We're now in office hours. So, all right, so this is chapter, we've gone through everything that's in chapter 5 and 6. So the next couple things are from those handouts I gave you. Those are the statistical inductive generalizations. Would it be helpful, would either of you or any of you like to go over how statistical inductive generalizations are different from probative inductive generalizations?
Yeah, could we?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. Not inductive generalizations, sorry, inductive arguments. Right. So these are everything in chapters 5 and 6. Right. Those are all examples of probative inductive arguments. A probative inductive argument is where the premises give you good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. But those reasons just aren't strong enough that the conclusion is certainly true. And what that usually looks like in practice is that the conclusion could be overturned if new evidence is discovered. So think of it almost like legally, right? Like in a law court, right? You're gonna get a bunch of testimony, right? Like, oh, here's the physical evidence. Oh, here's some eyewitness testimony, right? And all of that might be quite compelling, but if you discover later, actually one of those eyewitnesses was lying, or actually a corrupt police officer faked a bunch of that evidence, you would change your answer, right? So at the time, based on the evidence available to you, maybe you conclude guilty, but if new evidence comes to light, you would change your judgment. That's what we mean sort of by probative here, right? They give you, the premises give you reasons, but not certain reasons, reasons that could be overturned on the basis of other factors. Think of it almost like you have to make a choice. You have to choose, is the conclusion true or false? Based on the evidence, at least, it's more rational to believe that it's true. And that's the sense in which it's inductive. Right? The evidence just literally is weighed more toward the conclusion being true than toward the conclusion being false. The statistical inductive arguments, this is where, because of math, basically, you can say exactly how likely is the conclusion to be true. Right. So if 95% of Americans are opposed to eating their dead, and you're an American, then you're probably opposed to eating your dead. Right? We can say exactly how likely is that conclusion to be true? Well, if everything else is equal, 95%. There's a 95% chance that you're one of those people. That's not a question of new evidence. The conclusion could still be false if you just get unlucky. Right? Because since this is only a percent chance, there's also a percent chance of the conclusion being false too. But it's still, if you had to guess, you should guess on the basis of the higher percentage. So here, in the case of the probative arguments, it's the getting new evidence that causes the problem. In the case of statistical evidence, it's just a chance. Basically, the laws of probability are such that you could just get unlucky sometimes.
Can I ask a question about statistical? They're
Sure.
pretty easy to recognize when you have numbers like 65% of the world is, yeah, but are there any keywords that you should key into that make you realize that those are statistical right off the bat?
Other things, you can get things like almost all, the overwhelming majority of the time.
Yeah, like majority, like
Majority, certain majority, most, right? These are sort of where it's like, they're number words, but not a specific number, right? At least they're sort of like a counting word. Things like that can also indicate, like maybe like in that quiz question, from that I was saying was a statistical syllogism, that number 2. In there, yeah, there wasn't a number, but I think there was like an almost all or something like that there. That was sort of like at least a counting word.
Okay, cool. So just counting words, look for those.
That can be a hint at least. Yeah, that can be a hint. Because, yeah, I mean, at least in the course of normal everyday life anyway, we normally don't have exact percentages. We normally have, oh yeah, most of the time I've eaten mushrooms, I haven't liked them. So I'm probably not going to like these mushrooms either. So good with this distinction? And the reason why they're both called inductive arguments is basically just because they're not deductive. Inductive just basically means not deductive. So the deductive arguments are ones where the conclusion follows with certainty, right? Either because no new evidence could change anything, or because there's no wiggle room, there's no sort of margin of error that you get with a percent chance. Right. The two kinds of statistical arguments that we looked at, we've got the inductive generalizations, which I a little bit talked about already, so I won't go over that again unless any of you have specific questions about it. And also the statistical syllogisms. And again, we talked about those a little bit again already, so we can go over it. I'm happy to go over it again if anyone would like, but I'm not going to go out of my way for it. And then the last specific kind of problem that will be on the final are these sort of last things, the stuff from chapter 11 stuff. Right. Identifying the various sorts of biases or barriers to inquiry. And then sort of the hardest kind of question, there'll be one or two of them on the exam, where I sort of ask you to sort of combine everything, combine your analysis of the fallacies, with your analysis of these biases. And write out sort of conversational response to some sort of mistaken argument or an argument that's gone wrong to try to put it back on the right track.
So those will be very similar to 7, 8, 9 on the last group work.
Exactly right. They'll be basically exactly the same, also like that number 3 on the quiz too.
So with these, I think like it's really hard to get mixed up between, like my side bias and confirmation bias are really, really similar.
Sure.
There.
Absolutely.
A way to approach these problems that makes it be more clear? Like, is there a way where you have to distinguish between, is it a cognitive bias or a psychological bias? Does that help? Or I don't know, just to make sure that you're being specific enough to get it correct and not lose like a little bit of points.
Yeah, right. A little bit here or there. Yeah. I would say the most important thing is just to be really, really clear about precisely what each bias actually means. a general piece of advice, but this won't always work. That's why it's sort of general advice rather than something that will always work. Usually, the psychological biases are going to be things that just basically cause you to be reluctant to challenge your own views, whereas cognitive biases tend to be things that cause you to dismiss evidence. Those can go together, though, unfortunately, sometimes, right? Like, sometimes you dismiss evidence such that you can confirm your own beliefs or something, or preserve your own views. So that's not an absolute, but at least it can be a helpful, maybe, starting point anyway. Is the problem here that evidence is being dismissed in a way it doesn't really make sense? Or is the problem that a person doesn't want to admit that they're wrong? Or is it both? Probably just the best advice that I've got is just be really clear about what each of the biases are and how they sort of relate to the other biases. Each of them are distinct. They're all related. So if any of the biases sound the same to you, that may be, let's maybe bring that up and figure out why they're not really saying the same thing, what they're saying slightly different things. And then it just becomes a question of what's the best characterization with those slight differences in mind. And frequently, again, in a lot of cases, there'll be many equally good ways. But there'll also be frequently many that work sort of, but not necessarily as well or as clearly. So I don't know if that was helpful. That probably wasn't clear enough, maybe. So maybe do you have can you make that a more specific question, maybe? Like maybe are there two biases you'd like to talk about how they differ more precisely?
Yeah, let me just read through all of them.
Yeah, sure. And while you're doing that, actually, this is my general office hours too, so I'm just gonna send to my other two classes, send the Zoom link to them. But we can keep going as long as we need to. I don't know if anyone's actually gonna come to any of these from any of my other classes.
Oh, okay, so what about like the difference between representative bias and then the availability and vividness bias?
Yeah, those are very similar. Give me just 1 second.
Okay, yeah, no, take your time.
Just gotta send the invite to my other classes too. All right, those went out. Perfect. So let's do So let's talk representative bias versus availability and vividness. These are ones that will frequently go together, and frequently it won't be wrong to say either of them, but they are still slightly different. So let's clarify the difference. This is where I particularly assume that my own individual experience, it's almost like how like anecdotal evidence fallacy is working. Like it's my experience is representative of everyone else's experience. And again, it's important to note this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's kind of good that I assume most people have the same basic experiences as me. It lets me sort of relate to people and assume that in a lot of cases, I'm assuming that people are rational as a result of this assumption. I'm assuming that, oh, you've probably experienced similar things than me. When I give you examples in class, my examples are frequently based on the assumption that you and I have experienced roughly analogous things. Right? And so that I can talk about going to go see a movie and that you all have experiences of having to go and see a movie too. Right? When this becomes a bias is when I sort of dismiss experiences that disagree with my own. So again, sort of a rejecting of evidence. So I reject your testimony because your testimony doesn't sound like things that I've experienced in my own life. Whereas in fact, my own set of experiences are just one set of experiences, right? I shouldn't reject my own experiences either, but I should take your experiences seriously as well, right? Your experiences would count as evidence just as much as mine do. Availability and vividness is related in some sense. It still has to do with the meanness, but it's not my own experience necessarily. This has to do more with information recall than anything else. So, for example, maybe I've never been homeless on the street, so it's not a it's not a representative bias. It's not my own experience I'm talking about. But maybe I saw once a homeless person dying on the street, and that would be probably an incredibly significant event in my life. I would be able to draw up that memory really easily, right? That can sort of color what I accept is considered to be acceptable evidence. You know, so whereas if all I had heard was a statistic that was something like, I don't know, 50,000 homeless people die every year in the United States, I'd be like, oh, that sounds bad. That sucks, right? But that, just hearing that statistic isn't going to make the same impact on me as seeing that one homeless person die. It's sort of more, and that's why, like, you know, I don't even know if these commercials still exist, but when I was young, there were all these like Save the African Peasants commercials that were like for all these charities, and they were always this like the world's saddest music would play, and like the sad, most awful, horrible pictures you've ever seen of emaciated children, right? Because just saying, hey, poverty is a big deal in Africa, and you know, you should try to help people who are starving, that doesn't do as much as, in some sense, sort of emotionally impacting you. For better and worse in a lot of ways, right? I mean, a lot of the time, right, the thing that I can really easily recall is indeed a big deal, but it's not a big deal because I can easily recall it.
So would another example of that be something like people, I mean, like especially New Yorkers being able to, or like thinking that 9/11 is a bigger deal than like some war going on somewhere else, is
Sure.
because it's just more fresh to them?
Absolutely, that would be a perfect example of this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, and we can maybe use that as an example of a case where maybe like errors in reasoning could occur. If like, you know, oh, 9/11 was an egregious tragedy, whereas I don't really care about what happens in the 30-year war taking place in the Congo, even though, in fact, far more people have died during the 30-year war going on in the Congo than died in 9/11, but those deaths aren't as vivid to me as the deaths of people I saw on the TV screen or whatever, right? And so, yeah, then therefore I would sort of misweigh which of those perhaps what was a greater problem or had a cost, even just literally factual things like which one had a greater cost in human life, just something like that. Right. Whereas, like, if I had been in 9/11, right, if I had been in one of the buildings and had to evacuated, then that's more representative bias territory. That would be a case where they'd sort of go together. It would be a particularly vivid memory because I was there. It was something that happened to me. And in that case, both of those probably would be pretty reasonable answers. Is that helpful? Does that work? Because, yeah, I thought that was a good example.
Yeah,
I thought that was all right, good. Good. Any of the other ones be helpful to distinguish?
I'm good on chapter 11, but
Okay.
if anyone else has one. If they don't, could we talk about a couple of the fallacies?
Absolutely.
Two that I have questions on. One is the fallacies of unacceptability when we talked about equivocation.
Yes, you're not. So I'll just tell you right now, equivocation is not going to be on the exam. But
okay.
I'll go through it real fast. But equivocation is usually just too hard. Right? This is where the meaning of a word changes within the argument or a phrase. And these frequently sound like jokes, right? Like, at least if they're really obvious anyway, they sound like jokes and they're not arguments you're liable to take seriously anyway. So like, oh, the Great Plains are really big. I didn't know you could, Ohio's maybe in the Great Plains, so I guess Ohio can fly really high. You change the meaning of the word plane from.
I remember this. We were talking about like coronavirus and Corona beer and.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was one of your group came up with. Yeah, exactly. Right. The coronavirus is really dangerous, so I won't drink any Corona beers. Right. The meaning of the word has changed. If it's really the reason why there's not going to be any of these on the exam, if it's really obvious like that, you're not tempted to take the argument seriously anyway. If there's not much point in going over it, the more subtle cases, it's usually easier to just characterize the mistake in some other way. So you're not going to see one of these on the exam. It's just not, I don't think it's worth your time, especially the focus on this one, especially. So I'm not going to give you one of these. I think every other one I will, but that's the only, that one, it's just not worth it.
Okay. And then the other one, I was wondering if we could just go over straw person again, just as a review. I've always kind of struggled with that one.
Right. So this is usually going to take place when I am critiquing someone else's view. Right, so it's like that's why it'll frequently show up in the context of, say, a reductio ad absurdum, because reductio ad absurdum arguments are always attacking someone's view. Right. So let's give it just a rough form of an answer. Right. So, okay, if an argument looks something like this, you say X, but X is dumb because of Y, and Z, right? Because of some reasons, right? So you say we should cut taxes, but cutting taxes is a bad idea because we can't afford the loss in our income, and it wouldn't be fair to those who have been planning on the tax cut, something like that. Okay. When a fallacy has been committed is if I'm not getting what you say correct. If you didn't actually say the thing that I'm saying you said, my critique of your position is sort of irrelevant. And that's why this is one of the fallacies of illusory support, that it's just sort of literally irrelevant. So let's do it. And usually what you said is going to be far more sophisticated than what I misinterpreted you as saying.
And that's different from a red herring because the red herring would be like a distractor, right? Like
that's right. Yeah. Here, at least it sounds as if I'm talking about the same thing that you were talking about. Whereas the red herring is just completely irrelevant. The red herring is like, you say I cheated on my wife, but I love puppies. Right? It's just irrelevant. That has nothing to do with the topic. This probably at least sounds like it has something to do with the topic. At least if I've done it. Frequently people do this deliberately. Right? They deliberately misrepresent positions to make them sound worse. But it at least sounds like I'm talking about the same thing that you were talking about. But I'm not. Right. And I think there was any time in class, I forgot how long ago must this have been if we were actually in class, where I remember we were talking about like the Bernie Sanders, Fidel Castro comments. I remember, right. And I think maybe we did it in class is actually really good. Like there was a certain way of putting the critique that made it seem as if the objections people were raising were really, really foolish. But then I think you put it like in a more sophisticated way. You sort of like came up with a more sophisticated formulation of why you still thought what he was saying was objectionable. If someone had taken your more sophisticated position and turned it back into one of the dumber versions to say that you were wrong, that would be an example of committing the straw person fallacy. They would be misrepresenting your more nuanced position into something easier to refute. Is that helpful? Is that?
Yeah, that does. That was a good refresher. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, God, how long ago must that have been?
February, maybe?
Yeah, a million years ago at this point, I think. It's been quite a semester. Quite a semester. All right. Any of the other fallacies that we get to go over?
I think I'm pretty good. Unless there's one in particular you wanted to recommend that you think people have more trouble with than others, but that's on you.
The only one I can think of, just keep in mind that this is something I just noticed in some of the quizzes. People's explanations were usually okay, but they were just confusing these two. Fallacy of bias statistics is a fallacy that pertains to inductive generalizations. And similarly, the fallacy of incomplete evidence, that only occurs with statistical syllogisms.
Cool, and you wrote that right on the paper. So.
And a couple people were, I've seen on the quizzes, a couple people just confusing those. Sort of describing the fallacy of bias statistics, but calling it the fallacy of incomplete evidence or vice versa. So just maybe, just review. I think the difference between them is pretty clear. So maybe just review which term goes with which or whatever. And maybe review the distinction too. How they basically just are fallacies that pertain to different kinds of arguments. And I think those are the only ones that I distinctly remember being common mistakes on like quizzes or whatever recently. Yeah. All right. Good. Any other questions anyone has? Anything else anyone would like to go over?
I think I'm good on material. So when are you releasing the exam?
So I haven't written it yet. I'm going to try to write it tomorrow. My hope is it will be ready by 5 o'clock tomorrow, which would give you a little bit more than 48 hours to work on it. But the latest it'll be available is by end of the day on Tuesday. So you'll have a minimum of 48 hours.
Okay, so then it's due at the end of the day on Thursday.
That's right. Due end of the day Thursday. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
After you write it, I was wondering if it would be possible for you to, when you know how many points it's out of, throw that on the Canvas. That way we
it'll be out of 60.
What scores? It'll be out of 60.
Yeah. It's gonna be worth the exact same. It's not like worth more or anything. It's worth the exact same amount as the first, not the first exam, but the first like the one we were calling the midterm. It'll be worth the same number of points.
Cool. I always stress over that with the what if scores on the Canvas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it'll be worth the same. It'll be worth the exact same amount as that midterm exam was. They'll both be 60 points.
Well, I'm actually pretty good. I just want to say thanks. I appreciate you switching over to this digital format. So, well, I think it worked over pretty good. I'm sure that was a lot of work. So, thank you.
I'm glad it worked. That's the most important thing for me. So I'm glad if it worked, I'm glad that it did.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm good too. So I'm going to head out. But yeah, thank you so much for teaching this semester and everything.
Absolutely. And thank you all for your hard work. I mean, this was rough on, it was not easy for me. I'm sure it was far worse for you all. And you all did really great work in this class. I mean, you all worked really hard. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, you as well.
All right. Now, on an unrelated note, I didn't want to waste anyone's time, but I was going to say,
Well, if it's unrelated, let me just